Some military historians claim the American Civil War was the first major conflict where technology outstripped tactics, and the deadliness of the weapons surpassed the understanding of the generals. Courage and daring are no match for an artillery barrage, or mustard gas, or napalm, or radiation. And yet, when SF writers imagine future wars and even more powerful weapons, too often the results are as rah-rah, glory hallelujah as an old John Wayne movie. Let's get them aliens, boys. There's a whole subgenre of military SF by writers like Steve Sterling, Jerry Purnell, and David Drake. Bain Books churns out future war stories like sausages, and the crap really sells. Why do writers and readers like war? That's what I asked Kristine Kathryn Rusch, author, editor, and publisher.
War is conflict. War is the biggest kind of conflict that you can deal with in fiction.
Is it easy conflict?
No, it's difficult conflict, at least in my opinion. And I think it's dealt with much too simply in most fiction. You know, a war starts and a few people die and boom, it's over, or whatever happens. They don't deal with the complexities of war. I know that I was dealing with war in my first novel that's about to come out of Rock. And I came to a situation right toward the end of the book where it looked like the main character was going to have to bring, in order to achieve his ends, he was going to have to bring the entire cast of characters into a war. And I looked at that, and I spent about 4 days walking around my office saying, I can't do this, and realized that neither could my character. And that felt like a good response to me. And I wish there were a lot of other writers out there, especially the military SF writers in somewhere. I'm generalizing here, and I shouldn't be, but a lot of them, I do believe, trivialize what goes on in war.
As Paul Fussell points out in Wartime, Understanding and Behavior in the Second World War, we don't understand what normal combat is like, let alone atomic war or space war. You would expect frontline soldiers to be struck and hurt by bullets and shell fragments, but such is the popular insulation from the facts that you would not expect them to be hurt, sometimes killed, by being struck by parts of their friends' bodies violently detached. If you asked a wounded soldier or Marine what hit him, you'd hardly be ready for the answer, my buddy's head, or his sergeant's heel or his hand, or a Japanese leg complete with shoe and puttees, or the West Point ring on his captain's severed hand. Some SF writers have captured the pain of war. Connie Willis won a Nebula Award for her story Firewatch about time traveling back to London during the Blitz. One of my friends in Control ambushed Connie at a science fiction convention this spring and interrogated her about Firewatch.
Really fascinated by war. I think a part of this is because my uncle was killed at Guadalcanal in World War II, and so I have always been personally interested in it. But also because during the 60s, in the Vietnam era, so many people were so adamant in, that war was a 100% negative experience. And yet the research that I was doing for my Blitz story was indicating that it was not always a totally negative experience, that there are many aspects of war that, although you can't say they're positive, and they're certainly not positive enough that you should go out and start wars on purpose so that you could get these effects. Many people find a level of commitment, a level of camaraderie, and sometimes even fulfillment in their lives when they are faced with something as devastating as a war. I just recently wrote a story called Jack, which is coming out in Asimov, and I thought that the ARP wardens led also a really fascinating life, digging people out of the rubble, doing things that most of us would find horrific, more horrific than any of the horror novels being written today, but with a completely commonplace attitude toward it, like, oh, I found the arm, what do you think, sort of thing. And so I was amazed by what was basically a group of middle-aged women, young kids, and people with assorted disabilities that kept them out of the, of the draft, and also a bunch of old men who managed to behave in a totally heroic fashion during a time of incredible danger and disaster.
If you want heroics amid the danger and disaster, read war comics. During World War II, comics were a huge defense industry. Superman and Captain America fought Hitler. Some superheroes, like Canada's Freelance, were created specifically to fight the propaganda battle. These early comics portrayed war as a sort of a Cub Scout jamboree with guns. The man who changed things was Harvey Kurtzman. The comic was Two-Fisted Tales. Suddenly, comic combat was ugly, deadly. Then in the 60s came Blazing Combat from Warren magazine. Soldiers suffered battle fatigue, good men died. Comics didn't show the reality of men blown to bits, but they stopped peddling the John Wayne myths. Let's call up the editor of Blazing Combat, Archie Goodwin. Archie, it's Commander Rick. What was it like trying to produce a realistic war comic in the mid-60s?
At a time when most American comics were doing World War II comics that involved going through a comics code which demanded that no one fighting a war fire a gun at one another or ever kill anybody. Blazing Combat received a lot of attention because it was the first time in about 10 years there had been a reasonably realistic war comic. And the Vietnam War was just starting, and I think it was the first attempt ever to do stories dealing with the Vietnam War. It received a certain amount of notoriety because we dared suggest in one or two of the Vietnam War stories that perhaps we weren't entirely justified in being there, or there might be some confusion about our purpose in Vietnam, in being in Vietnam. As a result of that, the comics were taken off of Army post bases. So it was a short-lived book, but it established a reputation because of that. And also because it had some of the best artists in comics working for it. It had people like Reed Crandall, John Severin, Russ Heath, Wallace Wood, Al Williamson, Gene Colan, just an incredible lineup of people. And as the person writing most of the stories, I was incredibly lucky because you come off much better when you have a good artist making you look good.
My favorite thing about those comics was that you focused not on the battles, but on the people, soldiers and civilians.
Well, I think one of the tough things with reading a lot of war reference books is it's all about this regiment marched to this hill while the enemy was moving their battalions to this place, and in the meantime, General What's-His-Name was over here doing this, and it's incredibly dull. I learned from a brilliant comic genius named Harvey Kurtzman that the best war stories focused on individuals, usually individuals right in the thick of the whole thing, who maybe weren't really aware what the overall significance of it was. But I tried to show readers what the immediate experience for an individual was. And usually with almost any kind of story that you're trying to tell, you tell it through 1, 2, or 3 individuals, and hopefully draw the reader's interest and sympathy because of that.
Thanks, Archie. Over and out. Another one of my favorite war comics is Rogue Trooper. It was originally serialized in the British weekly 2000 AD. Rogue Trooper has recently been revived by the original artist on the series, Dave Gibbons. He's best known as the artist on the sophisticated miniseries The Watchmen. Now that he's writing Rogue Trooper, what does Dave hope to say about war?